Whenever I am afraid, I will trust in you. This verse is short enough that you could almost miss it if you're not paying attention, but it sits right in the middle of something very real. David doesn't say he never feels fear. He doesn't claim some elevated emotional state where fear is no longer part of the experience. He starts with it. Whenever I am afraid. That alone is worth slowing down on, because it's honest. It assumes fear will show up, not as a rare exception, but as part of the human condition. And that matters because a lot of people think faith is supposed to erase fear completely. But this verse doesn't frame it that way. It frames faith as something you do inside fear, not instead of it. So the movement of the verse is important. Fear is acknowledged first. Trust is chosen second. That sequence is the whole thing. It's a bit like being on a bike and suddenly hitting a stretch of road you didn't plan for. Maybe the surface changes. Maybe there's wind coming sideways. Maybe visibility drops a bit. You don't stop being on the ride just because conditions shift. You adjust. You keep your hands steady. You stay aware. You continue forward, even if your confidence feels a little shaken in the moment. Trust, in this verse, functions like that steadying action. It's not the absence of awareness. It's what you do with awareness when fear is present. And fear itself is not always irrational. Sometimes it's just information. It tells you something feels uncertain, or unstable, or unknown. The problem is not necessarily that fear shows up. The problem is what it tries to convince you of when it's in control. It tends to shrink the horizon. It makes tomorrow feel less trustworthy than it actually is. David's response here is not to argue with fear directly, but to redirect attention. Whenever I am afraid, I will trust in you. The focus moves from the internal reaction to the external anchor, not because the fear isn't real, but because it isn't final authority. There's also something subtle in the wording. It says whenever, not if. That removes the fantasy that spiritual maturity means fear never appears. Instead, it normalizes a repeated process. Fear comes, trust responds. Fear comes again, trust responds again. It's not a one-time victory statement. It's a practice way of living. That makes this verse less like a slogan and more like a reflex being trained over time. And if you think about it, most of life is like that. You don't eliminate difficult emotions by force. You learn how to respond to them without letting them take over the steering wheel or grab the handlebars. Trust, in a biblical sense, is not denial of reality. It's choosing what you believe is more ultimately true than what you currently feel. So when fear shows up, the question becomes, what do you place alongside it? Not to ignore it, but to reframe it. That you in the verse is doing a lot of work. It assumes there is someone reliable enough to carry a weight that your emotions can't carry alone. Not just in theory, but in practice. Something stable enough to return to when internal stability is not available. And that's where the application gets very simple, but also very real. It starts with not pretending fear isn't there. Naming it matters, even internally, even quietly. Because unnamed fear tends to expand. It becomes vague and harder to work with. But once it's acknowledged, it becomes something you can respond to rather than something that just occupies you. Then comes the second step, which is not complicated, but is intentional. You choose where to place your trust in that moment. Not after fear leaves, but while it's still present. That might look like a brief prayer that isn't elaborate. It might look like a returning to what you already know to be true rather than what you feel in the moment. It might simply be pausing long enough to refuse the assumption that fear is the final word on the situation. Even in everyday life, this plays out in small ways. Decisions, uncertainties, conversations, future plans that feel heavier than expected. The instinct is often to either panic or over-control everything. But Psalm 56 verse 3 introduces a third option. Acknowledge the fear and then deliberately shift your trust. Not as a performance, not as denial, just as a steady internal choice. And over time, that becomes a kind of stability that doesn't depend on circumstances being predictable. It's not that fear disappears. It's that fear stops being the thing that determines direction. Thank you for joining me here today, my friends and family. And I hope you go into this day boldly and that it brings you blessings and shalom. Hope to see you here tomorrow. And until then, Abba willing. Shalom, shalom.